Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers Walk by Faith Wednesday webinar, where Deacon Harold and guests explore our Catholic faith through passionate discussion. Get ready as Deacon Harold and his diverse guests bring an array of knowledge and life to Catholic teaching. You are watching Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers Walk by Faith Wednesday webinar.
Hello, and welcome to the Walk by Faith Wednesday webinar. I'm your host, Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers, and enjoy being with you every week. And I have a special treat for you this week. We have our first international guest on the Walk by Faith Wednesday webinar. This is a man that I spent a lot of time with on my tours in Australia. That's where he lives, in the state of New South Wales in Australia. And Matthew works for Parousia. And a lot of you know, of course, that my relationship with Charbel, Race, and Parousia and the folks there since 2012. And so Matthew is part of that, part of the organization. And, as I spent a lot of time driving around in the southern part of New South Wales with Matthew and down to Wagga Wagga and some other places, we got a chance to really talk and get to know each other. And Matthew just has pick your jaw up off the floor story about his faith journey. And I really like him to share that with you. So without any further ado, here's my good friend who's going to tell us about his powerful witness to the life of God working in his life and his family, Matthew-Tague. Matthew, welcome to the Walk by Faith Wednesday webinar.
Thank you very much, Deacon. It's an absolute honor to be with you.
So Matthew, just why don't you just kind of start from the beginning? Just tell us a little bit about your faith journey. Where are you a convert? Are you a cradle Catholic? What was it like growing up in your house in the faith? That kind of thing, and we'll get going.
Sure, no problem at all. Well, I'm what the Journey Home Network would call a revert. So I was born into the faith, but I was born into what I would call a culturally Catholic home. There was not a lot of faith in my home. We were more, Sunday Catholics. So there wasn't a lot of talking about the faith in the home. There were no crucifixes, nothing like that. And I was born in 1974. So by the time I hit school in the 80s and then high school in the 90s, this was during a period where even in school, we were not getting good catechesis in the home, and we were getting, pretty boring and ugly liturgies at the time as well. So eventually, because my parents, really, they were what you would call a dissenting Catholic. They didn't believe most of the infallible teachings of the church. So when I was about 13, they made the decision to put it to us children as to whether or not we wanted to continue attending Mass. And thank God I had the integrity, or the God-given integrity at the time, to know that if I wasn't going to obey the church, if I wasn't going to follow the precepts of the church, then I had no business presenting myself for Holy Communion. And so there was no point in going to Mass. I had better things to do with my Sundays. And so I left the church at about the age of 13. And this, of course, was coinciding with a particular behavior that strikes many 13-year-olds these days more than ever. And that was my first addiction of masturbation and pornography. And this was about the age of 13. So needing, some guidance and not finding any, I continued to walk away from the church, and I used scientism as my excuse. Right. So if the only knowledge worth knowing is that which we can gain by the scientific method, then the church was wrong and I could do whatever I liked. And of course, that would develop into a whole series of addictions because, unfortunately for me, I have the disease of alcoholism. And I drank alcoholically from the age of 13. My parents separated when I was 16. And so at this, here I am in this period where I've picked up my first drink and I've been instantly addicted to it. I'm also now lacking good father figures in my life. And so my drinking progressed very quickly and over a long period of time. I'm what the recovery rooms would refer to as a binge blackout drinker. So I could handle my drink some nights of the week. I could stop after a few, but you just never knew which night it was going to strike where, the tiniest amount of alcohol passed my lips, and one was too many, 100 was not enough. And so my life was pretty much a constant wreck. I found it very difficult to hold down jobs, find accommodation, all this sort of stuff. But of course, being utterly selfish and utterly addicted to my passions, I would always blame people and places. So in my 20s, I decided to go off traveling, and I went off to the UK, where I picked up more and more addictions. So by this stage, I'd become a sex addict. When the offer of getting into illicit drugs was made to me, I gleefully accepted it, and eventually even started selling drugs to fuel my addiction. So I was working in bars. I was working as a cocktail flair bartender. And so I had access to lots of free alcohol, but I also had access to lots of party people. And so I was with a guy who used to run security. We would work out this way of selling drugs to support our own habit, whereby I would make the arrangements and do the money exchange, and then he would exchange the goods. And so by the end of about 18 months, I was snorting about 6 grams of cocaine a week, and once a month going out and taking dozens of ecstasy pills, and I was an absolute wreck. And this is where Providence first stepped in the form of pneumonia. So at the end of the year 2000, I got pneumonia in Leeds in the dead of winter, and spent a week in Leeds General Infirmary. And it was a bit of a wake-up call. I realized I had 2 roads before me, and one led much more quickly to the grave than the other. And so I decided to stop and get out of the drug scene. So I moved up to Edinburgh, where my drinking continued. So a lot of addicts will talk about addictions being, the primary that has led to others. So for me, I really have the 2 primaries, because I've got that masturbation and addiction first and foremost, right? That addiction now to pleasure and passion. But then I also suffer from this disease of alcoholism. There's actually a physical abnormality in me which causes me to have these cravings for alcohol. So those 2 addictions kept going. They stayed with me. And so even though I'd gotten rid of all the illicit drugs in Edinburgh, I was still, enslaved to my passions. And then Providence stepped in again. And this time it was through the death of my grandfather. So he hadn't died at this stage. He'd gone in for an operation on his legs, and everything started shutting down. He was just at the end of his life, and it was his time. And he and I had a phone call at one stage. And the last thing he said to me was, "When are you coming home?" All right. Little did I know that would have a double meaning much, much later. And I, of course, couldn't get home. I'm a dual national, so I was able to go over there on a one-way ticket. And I was such a mess, I didn't have the money to get home. But my family rallied together and offered me a ticket. And I had a decision to make, to stay where I was, keep going on my adventures, or come home. And I think for the first time in a long while, I felt some real emotion. So I jumped on a plane, came home, was picked up from the airport, taken straight to my grandfather's deathbed. And he was still alive. He should have died by now. It was miraculous that he was still alive, waiting for the last of his grandchildren to arrive. And so he couldn't see me, he couldn't talk, but he could hear me. And when he heard my voice, his hands was twitching, reaching for me. So I was able to grab his hand and sit there and talk and tell him of all my wonderful adventures. And then the nurses came in, they wanted to do some observations and turn him. And so we all stepped out of the room, but they very quickly called us back in. And it was then that I witnessed the actual moment of death of my grandfather. And it was also the death of my scientism. Because in that moment, I saw my grandfather going from being a living, breathing human being to simply a body undergoing the biological processes of death. And there was something happened in that room that is ineffable. I cannot describe it. And one of the nurses even said, at the exact same moment, there he goes. You know, it was a palpable, it was a real moment that something happened, and now we were just there with a dead body. And so this was an experience that I was never going to be able to test with the scientific method. And so it was the beginning of the end for me with that very blessed moment with my grandfather.
You know, that's beautiful. You know, Father Robert Spitzer talks a lot about this, the near-death experience, because this is something that atheists will use all the time. Again, using that scientific method, you know, they would say, unless you can see, taste, touch, measure, or quantify something, it's not real, right? But now here you are, you know, thinking in that vein, but now you're experiencing the death of your grandfather here, and you experience something that's beyond logic, beyond something that's tangible, beyond the empirical. Now you're getting into the supernatural, right? You're getting into the beyond. And so how did things change for you after that experience?
I'd love to say they changed dramatically, but I cannot, because of course I had the disease of alcoholism. And so I still had 5 years of drinking left in me. But I will tell you that experience did gnaw at me. It was constantly kind of working on me in the back of my mind. And of course, all 4 of my grandparents were the ones that witnessed to me in their Catholic faith. They were all good, solid Catholics. And so that fact combined with this experience was always at the back of my mind. But, you know, this is why drunkenness is a sin. It darkens the intellect. All right. It weakens the will. And so I continued being enslaved to my passion. And the next thing that came along was providential in a way, but also one of the worst things that's ever happened in my life. And that was the suicide of my sister. We had known she was experiencing some problems for about a year, but she eventually had a breakdown. She was put on some medication, and 10 days into this new medication, she took her own life. And so, as I say, it was one of the most horrible things that's ever happened to me. It still affects me, and my heart goes out to anyone who has experienced this. But it really started making me question my own mental health. So I saw a GP. They put me on a drug, right, to help me for anxiety. And you know, when you read the pamphlets on drugs, and they've got common side effects, less common side effects, and rare side effects. Yeah, I got the rare stuff. I went through absolute hell for a period of about 36 hours. I couldn't sleep. I was agitated. My anxiety went through the roof. My legs wouldn't stop moving. It was a really bad reaction to this drug. So, but in actual fact, it kind of helped me deal with my sister's death, because I realized that she was probably going through something like that or worse. And I could really understand the desire to take one's own life, because it was sheer madness. But thankfully, I didn't take that route. Eventually, I got it together enough to ask a flatmate to take me to the hospital, and they told me it had been a very rare and severe reaction, and I should seek counseling. Now, I'd been seeing a bereavement counselor after my sister's death. And so I was able to get an appointment with that counselor very quickly. And I began recounting what had happened to me. And she really knew her stuff, this counselor, because she really focused on the first night. So the first dose of the drug, my anxiety goes through the roof. And what's my reaction? I pick up a drink. Right? At the end of that session, she said to me the words that would change everything. I think you might be an alcoholic. And finally, God's just and true punishments had brought me low enough that I was able to say, you know what, I think you might be right. So I went home and I called a 12-step program, and it was Alcoholics Anonymous. The guy on the phone was very sympathetic, and he said, okay, this is actually kind of good that you're calling today, because our annual convention is in Sydney this year, and it starts tonight. Now, as many people know who have been to a 12-step program, normally you walk in there feeling really terrible and really nervous because you're about to tell your story to, like half a dozen strangers. I found myself outside the ballroom in the Hilton Hotel in Sydney with 3,500 people, massive group. And I had not decided whether or not I was going to go in. I was really reluctant to go in. And I remember distinctly getting really annoyed with people because these people kept walking past me and really annoying me by saying, hello. It took about 20 minutes, but eventually I realized something. They were smiling and I wasn't. And I wanted some of what they had. So I made the phone call and experienced what I would later find out was the most intense Easter Triduum of my entire life. It was the Easter Thursday in March of 2007 that I first came into contact with Alcoholics Anonymous, and by the grace of God, I've been sober ever since.
Wow, praise God. That's awesome. You said something very important there. I tell parents, especially who have children who are struggling with drug and alcohol addiction, so we've been praying, they've been going in and out of rehab. I said, and I tell them about the parable of the prodigal son. I think the most poignant moment is when he's in the pig pen. And, and Jesus takes it to a whole nother level, because obviously the dietary laws in Leviticus, right? They couldn't have any pigs and catfish, bottom feeding fish and lobster. They can't have any of that kind of stuff. So pigs were considered filthy, disgusting animals. So it was bad enough when they said he was in with the pigs, but then Jesus says he longed to eat what the pigs ate. So now it's not he's just with the pigs. He wants to eat with them. What do pigs eat? Garbage. But and I'm sure it doesn't say in the scriptures, but I'm sure somebody threw up when he said that. He's like, oh, because he was driving the point home. You cannot get any lower than where he was, right? And it was at that moment that he in that pit of loneliness that he realizes God is the only one that can help me. And it's then that he makes the decision to have that metanoia, right? Or shub in Hebrew, which literally means to turn your mind around. So it's not just turn around. It's to turn your mind or turn your orientation around. You're going from one direction, now you're going in an opposite direction, back toward the Father. And that was the journey for you. So you do the Alcoholics Anonymous, and so how are you progressing in your faith life during this time, and what other kinds of things you're struggling with, and eventually what made the difference, to get you over that hump, past all of this, and now you're starting to move and open yourself more deeply to what God wants to do in your life.
Yeah, well, this, the experience of my grandfather's death opened me up to the supernatural. And now I was walking around as a living, breathing miracle, because, of course, the most natural thing for a person with an addiction like alcoholism to do is to drink. But we hand our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. And at the time, I considered myself agnostic. And so I was handing my will and my life over to a higher power who could take this disease from me, and thereby experiencing a miracle. And so I was very open. Now, after about 2 years, I met a woman. How often does it happen when one comes to Christianity through a woman? So I met the woman who is now my wife. And at the time, I remember telling my mother that I'd met the perfect girl for me. She was a sci-fi fan. She loved Star Trek, good sense of humor, beautiful. But there was just one problem. She was Christian. All right. But as I started to get to know her, I thought, well, hang on, I'm an agnostic. I'm a spiritual person. So maybe we could make it work. So I started getting to know her. And so I started going to her church, a low Anglican church in Fairy Meadow in Wollongong. And what I found there, Catholics can really learn from, because I found a church that was very community-based, very community-focused, very welcoming. very open, very willing to talk about the faith. They had good reasons for the faith that was in them. They did Bible studies. They cooked meals for each other when there was a new baby or illness and all this sort of stuff. So what I found in that church was a fellowship similar to that which I'd found in the 12-step programs. And they had really intelligent answers on faith and science. And so I got good catechesis on the subject of faith and science. And so in the end, I agreed to do an Alpha course. They had offered an Alpha course soon after I came onto the picture. And so I did that course, and it was in the second week of the Alpha course, as I was being reintroduced to Jesus Christ. So Jesus 101, it's the Alpha, it's not the Omega. I had a spiritual experience. I had another, spiritual experience, an inner locution. I actually heard a voice kind of in my head, and it said to me, I have proven my existence through the miracle of sobriety, and it is now time for you to know my name. And that was an incredible moment, absolutely incredible. I'll never forget it. It was one of those ineffable moments. A few days later, I experienced another even more powerful experience. I was heading up north for my brother's birthday and crossing the Hawkesbury River. And the crossing at the Hawkesbury, it goes down a big hill, across the river, and then up a big hill. And as I was heading down the hill, I was starting to think about my previous life, right? All the sins I had committed, all the offenses against God. I had slept with married women. That was adultery. I was complicit in 2 abortions. To this day, my deepest regret, and that was murder. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I'd committed offenses against all 10 commandments. And when I got to the bottom of the hill, it was pouring rain, and I didn't believe that God could forgive me. And so I was crying. I was bawling my eyes out at this stage. And then I hit the other side and started driving up the hill. And suddenly the clouds broke, and my car was blasted with sunlight. And I suddenly heard that voice in my head again, full of mercy and compassion, which said, of course, I can forgive you. And my life was changed from that moment irreparably. I had experienced the justice of our Lord as I was coming down the hill, but as I was going back up the hill, I experienced a full-blown, dose of his mercy. And it literally changed everything. And it made me want to evangelize. It made me want to be involved in mission. And so that took me off to a Bible college to become a Protestant minister. Right? I wanted all in. And it was at Bible college that I started seeing firsthand the disunity of Protestantism. I'll never forget one particular lesson where we were doing the Acts and we were doing the gifts of the Holy Spirit, and an argument broke out. Initially, it was between the lecturer and a student, but then it was lecturer to student and student to student and student to lecturer. They were all arguing. Eventually, the whole thing devolved into Pentecostal bashing. But I saw in that classroom the disunity of Protestantism really writ large. And I'd also experienced at Bible college the misrepresentation of Catholic beliefs. I'd learned enough from my grandparents to know that when they started saying stuff like Catholics believe that popes are infallible, right? Not that when they're teaching on faith and morals they're infallible, but popes themselves, I thought, I don't think that's what Catholics believe. And so I made a decision to not only study Protestantism, but also Catholicism at the same time, with one important difference. I was going to study Catholicism from Catholic sources. And Providence stepped in once more. I have developed carpal arthritis in the carpal joints. Very difficult sometimes to hold books open, particularly textbooks. So the solution I found was to buy my textbooks on the Kindle, the Amazon Kindle. And what happens when you do that is that Amazon wants you to buy more books. And so they keep throwing up suggestions for new books based on your previous purchases. And one day this book popped up, The Complete Ante-Nicene and Nicene and Post-Nicene Church Fathers, $3.01. Best $3.01 I've ever spent, because I began reading the church fathers, and guess what, Deacon? I found the Catholic Church. And then after about 5 months of private personal study, discovering Scott Hahn and others, I was eventually convinced. But I needed to push over the line, and I had another incredible spiritual experience whereby I'd done all this study. I was totally convinced. But I got down on my knees and I said, God, you know what I've studied. You know that I think that the Catholics have the superior arguments here, but this could cost me my marriage. This may actually make me suffer. And, I think I need a little sign. I need a sign from you to tell me that your church is true, that it's Catholic, and you want me there. Now, I'd only asked for a little sign. What I got was a waterfall on the head. All right, full-blown experience of the Holy Spirit. It kind of washed through me head to foot. I felt like I was vibrating at like a higher pitch. It was just unbelievable and so hard to describe. And what I saw in my mind was the Protestant doctrines disappearing and the Catholic doctrines remaining. And then eventually the only doctrine that was before me was the Holy Eucharist. And after that, the experience moved into this time of just pure inner peace. It felt like I was in liquid truth. It's too hard to describe, but from that moment, I was home. I was home in Holy Mother Church, and the words of my grandfather now had a double meaning. When are you coming home, my Catholic grandfather? And indeed, I was home, and that was the 21st of September, 2015, St. Matthew's feast day.
Oh, that's well, yeah, because your name is Matthew. How
Yeah,
perfect is that, right?
Need more proof, right?
That's awesome. That's awesome. So obviously it didn't cost you your marriage, but I would suppose when, what typically happens is when one person's faith stays where it is and the other person's faith grows, it creates a gap, right? And it caused some issues there. So, and in the midst of all that, you're still working, still trying to provide for your family. Then how did you get connected with Parousia and the great work that Charbel and Parousia are doing?
Yeah, well, we moved to the Shoalhaven, so down from Wollongong to Shoalhaven for Jenna's work. She's a town planner. And in actual fact, I was out of work because I've got a permanent back injury. I broke my back in 2004. And I found that employers wouldn't even give me an interview because they were asking for medical information on the forms. So we went through a very difficult period during my conversion as well. So it was after it was actually pretty early on. Providence, again, we were visiting Jenna's parents in the Blue Mountains, and I saw in the local parish bulletin that they were having a conference on the weekend. And that conference was called It's Great to Be Catholic, a Parousia conference. So I asked my wife if I could have a pass out for the day, and I went off to this conference, and I heard Simon and Madeline Carrington speak on chastity. I heard Shabal Reish give his testimony, and I heard Robert Haddad speak about the Eucharist, and I was an instant fan. And I looked at their website and I found that they stocked all of the speakers and the authors that had helped bring me home. So I started using Parousia as my canon. If someone recommended an author or a book to me, I'd go to their website. I'd check out the author. If it was on their website, I knew it was okay, because I noticed pretty quickly that a lot of people in the Catholic Church were trying to take me in different directions. So I kept going to their events, eventually meeting some great speakers and some of my heroes. But the first time I met Dr. Edward Sri was at up at a church in Sydney, and it was great meeting him. But this was the first time that Shabal Reish and I actually talked, because he got swamped on the resource table afterwards, and he was the only one there. So I just went up and said, look, I've had 15 years point of sale experience. Would you like a hand? And he was like, yes, please. So I just helped him out. And then afterwards, we just got talking. And he found out that I used to work as an audiovisual technician on live corporate events. So a few months later, or rather a year later, he dragged me up to Sydney to pick my brains, because he was about to have the biggest event that Parousia had ever had. And that was 4 Catholic Answers speakers coming out to Australia at the same time. And so, I was happy to go up and give them advice. And so it was Shabo Reish, Miguel Zaragoza, our content guy and cameraman, and they're both asking me questions about live events. And it became pretty obvious that I had some experience that they lacked. And so while I'm giving them advice and they're asking questions and having a conversation, eventually I said, you know what you guys really need to get you started is a run sheet. And I'll never forget Miguel's reaction, because he's turned to Chabelle and said, told you so. And of course, as soon as I said, you guys need a run sheet, little voice in the head says, so what are you going to do about it? So I volunteered. I said, look, why don't I volunteer to be your event manager? This is what an event manager would do. You run sheets, sweat the small stuff for you, blah, blah, blah. And Chabelle said, yes. So a week later, I spent 4 out of 5 days with one of my heroes, Dr. Edward Sri. And it was absolutely amazing. We got to the last event that I was involved in at Our Lady of Lebanon in Sydney. And he was just had his hands out just saying, how do I ever thank you? I'm like, are you kidding? I've had a ball. I met Dr. Sri. I should be thanking you. And he said, great. Do you want to do it again with Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers? Are you kidding? Yes, please. So then, like a month later, I found myself spending 9 out of 14 days with your good self. And, after that, I was part of the furniture.
Yeah, that's true. And it's actually because of you that we have our cat right now too, Harriet. That's right. just to let people know, we were driving in the car. It was a long drive.
It was.
And so during that, my daughter texted me and said, Daddy, want to get a cat. And we already had a dog, and I'm not a huge pet person, but and so she was trying to make this case for the cat. And so Matthew was there, and I was just sharing with him what was going on and stuff. And Matthew, in our conversation, kind of convinced me. I said, well, okay, based on what you were said, okay, get the cat. And are you serious? Like, yeah, you can get the cat, And actually, I got to admit, Matthew, you were spot on, because Harriet is amazing. I really like Harriet a lot, actually. she's a great cat. She's been a wonderful, I think, addition to our pet family here. And she's great. So good call there, Matt.
Yeah, and of course, one of the things you were concerned about was your allergies. And of course, I have cat allergies as well, but I'm a cat person. So what I was trying to say to you is that quite often it's only when the cat gets near my face, and I find if I go and wash my face, it sorts a lot of it out. And there's also some eucalyptus sprays that I use, and that really kind of pushed you over the line, I think.
Yeah, that's right. It's never been an issue. Well, yeah, Matthew, man, it's been so great talking to you, man. It's so great seeing you. And again, I was supposed to be on tour there in Australia, New Zealand, this past August, but of course that didn't happen. We're trying to plan something again with Sonia Corbett, for us to do something together for the Ignite Bible study. We're gonna do a tour. That didn't happen. So it's just one thing after another with this COVID. But but this has brought an opportunity to bring us together in this format, the Walk by Faith Wednesday webinar. So now people are going to know who you are. They're going to hear your story and hopefully be inspired to really go deeper in their faith. If they're going through a struggle, like you shared very openly your struggles with alcohol and pornography and things like that, and drugs, and to where you are right now. You just have to ask you, how could people believe there's not a God? You make a change like that. And so I'm so grateful that you're on with us today.
It's been an absolute honor for me. In our previous interview, you shared with us how you still feel nervous after talks, and that really helped me, because I get really nervous before speaking. I'm not comfortable in front of the camera, and I keep saying to God, look, feel free to take my ministry from me at any time you like, Lord. And it's so funny that every time I pray that prayer, I get another booking. So he clearly doesn't want me to finish yet.
Yeah, well, thank you, Matt. So we'll definitely have you back on. We'll talk about some topics in the faith, things that you've come to learn and to love about our Catholic faith as a revert. And again, I think it'll be very powerful for people to share. They can share this video with family members that are struggling, family members that are questioning things about the faith. Sometimes they maybe even share it with their kids who are struggling and say, see, there is hope. There is a God. Look what God did. If he did it for Matthew, he could do it for you.
Amen.
So thank you again, Matthew, for joining us. And I look forward to having you on again. And thank all of you for joining us. And we'll see you next week on the Walk by Faith Wednesday webinar with Deacon Harold. Until then, take care, my friends, and may God bless you abundantly.
Thank you for watching Deacon Harold's Walk by Faith Wednesday webinar. Tune in next Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time for more.